The East End of London was never silent. Even in the dead of night, the city breathed, wheezing, shivering, grinding, along under the weight of too many bodies and too little hope. Gas lamps flickered, water dripped from broken gutters. The smell of cold smoke, sweat, and yesterday's refuse curled through every narrow street. And somewhere in the dark, a woman was walking alone. She was 43 years old, small, tired, wrapped in a black bonnet she thought made her look fashionable, maybe even pretty. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, though most people called her Polly. History remembers her as the first canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. But before she was a victim, she was a mother. Before she was a headline, she was a daughter. Before she was a tragedy, she was a woman trying, desperately, to survive a world that had abandoned her. Tonight, we walk beside her, not to glamorize the horror, not to elevate the man who killed her, but to restore the humanity the Victorian newspapers stripped away. Welcome back to The Eclectic. I'm your host, and tonight we begin a journey into Whitechapel in 1888, but not the way you might expect. This isn't about Jack the Ripper. This isn't about the myth, the mystery, or the man. This is about the women, their lives, their world, their struggle, their humanity. And we begin with the woman history too often reduces to a crime scene photograph and a line in a police report. Mary Ann Polly Nichols. Mary Ann Nichols was born on the 26th of August 1845, just 1 year before the birth of the modern sewer system. London was expanding faster than it could handle. Poverty was a way of life, disease was common, but childhood, for her, wasn't extraordinary. It was simply working class. Her father, Edward Walker, was a locksmith, a skilled trade, stable, as stable as anything could be in Victorian England. Mary Ann grew up in a respectable family, church-going, hard-working, loyal. Nothing in her early years foretold the tragedy that would become her legacy. At 18, she married William Nichols, a printer. Printing was a good trade, steady pay, decent hours, somewhere between artisan and industrial worker. They had 5 children, 5 small mouths to feed, dress, shelter, and soothe. And like so many women of her time, Mary Ann's life became a cycle of pregnancies, childcare, housework, and endless labour. There were no days off, no mental health breaks, no welfare, no legal protections, just duty, relentless, exhausting duty. The marriage began to crumble under pressure. Money problems, alcohol, arguments, grief over lost children. 2 of their 5 would die young. William claimed Mary Ann deserted him and left their children in his care. Mary Ann insisted he wanted her gone so he could live with a neighbour. The truth likely sits somewhere between the two, as it so often does in messy human stories. But what matters is this. Once Mary Ann stepped outside her marriage, the world punished her. A separated working-class woman in the 1880s was not pitied. She was judged, shamed, pushed to the margins. Respectability was everything, and Mary Ann no longer had it. Her father tried to take her back in, but shame, alcohol and hardship were already tightening around her like a vice. Soon Mary Ann was moving between jobs. Domestic service, cleaning, sewing, anything that paid enough to eat. But the jobs were temporary. The wages were starvation level. and Mary Ann began to fall into the part of Whitechapel reserved for women no longer deemed useful to society. To understand Mary Ann's final years, you have to understand the cruelty of the workhouse. The workhouse wasn't a shelter. It was a threat, a punishment, a deterrent designed to keep the poor in line. Conditions were intentionally degrading. Men, women and children separated. Gruel for meals, stone breaking, occam picking, bone cleaning labour, shared beds with strangers, disease everywhere. If you went into the workhouse, society believed one thing about you. You'd failed. But Mary Ann didn't fail. The system failed her. She moved in and out of these institutions throughout the 1880s, each stay breaking her a little more. There are records of her being turned up for drunkenness, records of her trying to find work, records of her begging her family for help. Each time she tried to climb back up, and each time the world pushed her down again. Whitechapel in 1888 was one of the darkest corners of London. The slums were overcrowded, dangerous, disease-ridden, rat-infested, violent and soaked in cheap gin. There were approximately 8,500 sex workers in the East End, with an estimate of 1,200 in Whitechapel alone. Most weren't full-time sex workers. Most weren't women living in sin. Most weren't fallen. They were simply poor. Women like Mary Ann often sold sex as a temporary means of survival, not a profession, but a last resort. The price of a bed for the night was 4p. If you couldn't get it, you walked all night or slept on the street. Think about that. Imagine being so cold, so exhausted, so hungry that you'd do anything for 4p. Now imagine doing that every night. That was Mary Ann's world. In 1888, Mary Ann bounced between the Lambeth workhouse and cheap East End lodging houses, places like Thrall Street and later Flower and Dean Street, where beds were crowded and privacy was a luxury. Mission halls and temperance groups sometimes tried to rescue women like her, but nothing offered long-term safety or stability. Each attempt to climb out of poverty was fragile, and the streets were always waiting for her return. It's the 31st of August, 1888. Around 1 a.m. Mary Ann returns to her lodgings house at 18 Thrall Street. She's drunk. She's been in the pubs. She's trying to stay warm, trying to stay awake. But she can't pay for her bed. The deputy tells her she needs 4p. She tries to bargain. He refuses. She walks out into the street, adjusting her black bonnet. The bonnet she had been so proud of. She says, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a fine bonnet I've got." Was she joking? Desperate? Trying to keep her spirits up? We'll never know. She meets Emily Holland outside the grocer's shop on the corner of Whitechapel Road and Osborne Road. Mary is described as being very drunk and staggering around. She had made her DOS money, but had sadly drunk it away. Mary tells Emily that she will share a bed with a man and make her money. She walks towards Whitechapel Road and then down into Bucks Row, a narrow, dimly lit, quiet road lined with stables. It's 3:40 a.m. when Charles Cross discovers her. He thinks she's drunk. He shakes her. No response. A second man, Robert Paul, joins her. Together, they pull her skirt down to cover her modesty. They think she's still unconscious. Then the police arrive, and they see the truth. Her throat had been cut twice, her abdomen slashed open. Her injuries, too severe to describe lightly. Mary Ann Nichols died alone, in pain, in fear, in the cold. But she died quickly, and perhaps that is the only mercy she was given. The newspapers had a field day. The East End was terrified. Morality crusaders blamed prostitution. Politicians blamed poverty. The church blamed sin. But almost nobody blamed the system that created Mary Ann's desperation. Her family were called to the mortuary to confirm what the police now suspected. People who had known her in life, women from the workhouse, from the streets, recognised her first, then her estranged husband William and her father, Edward Walker, formally identified her. Imagine being led into a cold, tiled room and asked whether the mutilated woman on the slab is your wife, your daughter, the person you argued with, worried about, maybe even gave up on, now reduced to a body under a sheet. There are no recorded last words from her father at that moment. No grand speech, no neat quote to make the history books tidier or more poetic. What we do know is that he confirmed who she was, and then had to live with the knowledge that his child had died in the most public, violent way possible. That in itself is devastating enough. We don't need to embellish it. After the inquest, after the headlines, after the fear swept through Whitechapel like a fever, Mary Ann Nichols was taken on her final journey. On the 6th of September, 1888, her family gathered at Ilford to bury her, quietly, without ceremony, without the dignity her life rarely afforded her. She was laid to rest in the City of London cemetery in Manor Park, in a public grave. A pauper's grave, the kind assigned when a family had little money, or when tragedy moved too quickly for anything more. There was no headstone, no inscription. Nothing to say a mother of 5 had lived and struggled and laughed and hurt and tried. Nothing to tell the world that she had mattered. For over 100 years, Mary Ann lay there, unnamed beneath the grass, her story known only as a line in a police file or a footnote in a Victorian newspaper. Visitors to the cemetery would pass her resting place without ever knowing. But time, it has a way of circling back to the forgotten. In the 1990s, long after Whitechapel's gas lamps had turned to electric glow, cemetery staff placed a simple granite marker over her grave. Not elaborate, not grand. Just enough to finally acknowledge that a woman named Mary Ann Nichols had lived and suffered and deserved to be remembered. Her name, at last, carved into stone. Not as a victim of a killer, but simply as a person. A person who walked this earth. A person who had a family. A person who had a life before tragedy took it away. And that, perhaps, is where her story begins again. Not with violence, but with recognition. Not with horror, but with humanity. When people talk about Jack the Ripper, they talk about theories, mystery, suspects, conspiracies. They talk about letters, taunts, maps, shadows, myths. But they so rarely talk about the women, the real people, the lives demolished not by a legend, but by poverty, gender inequality, alcoholism, housing injustice, and a society that discarded women like rubbish when they slipped even slightly out of line. Mary Ann's story isn't a murder story. It's a social history, a warning, a portrait of what happens when a society abandons its most vulnerable. She wasn't targeted because of who she was. She was targeted because she lived in a world where women like her were invisible, and the man who killed her took advantage of that invisibility. He didn't kill a prostitute. He killed a woman who was trying to live. In remembering Mary Ann Nichols, we honour more than a victim. We honour a woman who struggled, who hoped, who fought, who tried. A woman who lived through hardship we can barely imagine today. A woman lost to history until the wrong person crossed her path in the early hours of a cold August morning. Mary Ann was not a footnote. She was not a name on a list. She was not a shadow walking toward an inevitable fate. She was a human, and she deserved better. Let her be remembered for her life, not her death. Thank you for joining me tonight on The Eclectic as we restored the story of Mary Ann Nichols, the woman, the mother, the survivor. Next time, we continue our journey through the shadows of Whitechapel as we follow another life lost too soon, Annie Chapman, a woman whose story is heartbreakingly different but eerily familiar. Because the Ripper didn't just murder 5 women, he exposed a world that was already failing them. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and as always, stay eclectic.